1. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation on the criminalization of the mentally ill presented by Dr. Carol Ray. We are very pleased to host this webinar on a new platform, Zoom. I just ask that you bear with me today because this is my first time using the platform and I'm sure there may be a few hiccups. So, I appreciate your patience. I just want to remind everybody there will be a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. Be sure to write your questions in the Q&A box to ensure that I can read them at the end. A little bit about Dr. Ray. Dr. Ray's career spans over several fields, from teaching anatomy, biology, physiology at the college level, to working as project coordinator at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore within the Department of Physical Therapy. Additionally, she has worked in research as a senior research program coordinator at the Johns Hopkins Center on Aging and Health in Baltimore, Maryland. Carol has also worked as an executive director of an agency that focused on the disaggregation of data for minority groups. Carol is a blog contributor to the renowned mental health speaker Hakeem Rahim's weekly blog. Carol has contributed to numerous state and county publications that focus on mental health, including her own book entitled PhDs Have Bipolar Too, My Story. Carol wrote her book as a result of a tragedy that occurred in her life on June 2nd, 2011. She is also the author of Poems Inspired by My Mother and A Celebration of Life, which was inspired by the sudden onset of her mother's illness and subsequently given 2 days to live due to cancer. Yet, by the grace of God, her mother lived 2.5 months. Through it all, Carol never gave up on Jesus Christ. She currently works at Virginia Multicultural Clinical Center as an applied behavioral technician. She also serves on the board of directors of the National Alliance on Mental Illness in Prince William County, Virginia. Carol desires to tell her story in order to address the problem of the criminalization of the mentally ill. She also wants to be a voice and advocate for those who have mental health conditions, as Carol herself has bipolar disorder. Thank you so much, Dr. Ray, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Aubrey, for providing me this opportunity to speak to your audience. First, I want to talk about the statistics regarding the mentally ill in prisons and jails. 43.8 million people experience a mental illness in a given year. According to NAMI, 1 in 5 people in the United States have a mental illness. 2.6%, which is around 6.1 million of American adults live with bipolar. 40% of families of persons with mental illness reported that the individual had been arrested at some point in their lives. The jail is the largest mental health facility. The Twin Towers Correctional Facility in Los Angeles is California's largest psychiatric facility, and Chicago's Cook County Jail is the largest psychiatric facility in Illinois. Both incarcerate about 3,000 mentally ill inmates at any given time. Prisons today contain more than 10 times the number of people with mental illnesses than all psychiatric hospitals. The Council of State Governments report that jails in the United States now report between 20 and 80% of their inmates suffer from a mental illness. So what is the definition of criminalization of the mentally ill? Arresting and jailing an individual who for committing a crime as a result of a mental illness is considered the definition of criminalization of the mentally ill. So first I want to give you a history of the problem. In the United States from 1770 to 1820, mentally ill individuals were often confined in prisons and jails. If the mentally ill were not violent, they were often kept at home. Yet, if they were violent, they were confined to prisons and jails. Also, jailers were often paid a fee by the individual's family or by the town for confining the individuals. Oftentimes, during this early period, there were voices of protest for confining the mentally ill. During this period, this practice was regarded as inhumane. As a result, such protests led to a Pennsylvania hospital in Philadelphia in 1752 to admit its first mental health patients. This was known as the nation's first psychiatric ward in a hospital. In 1773, Governor in Virginia named Francis Fauquier authorized a building in Williamsburg, Virginia to be the nation's first psychiatric hospital. In the 1920s, the Boston Discipline Society was formed by Reverend Louis Dwight, a Yale graduate and minister who distributed Bibles to mentally ill inmates in the jails. And not only that, just inmates in general. He was horrified by the conditions that he saw. As a result, the society began to publicly advocate for improved prisons and jails, and more specifically, hospitals for the mentally ill prisoners. In 1827, Reverend Dwight's advocacy led to the development of a committee by Massachusetts legislature to investigate the conditions of state's jails. The committee reported the awful conditions of those in prison. As a result, the committee recommended that imprisoning the mentally ill be made illegal. Years later, Massachusetts approved the building of the state hospital for about 120 patients. This hospital opened in 1833. During the first year, more than half of the admissions were transferred from jails and prisons. After Reverend Dwight's advocacy, Dorothea Dix followed in suit in 1841. She began her crusade when she taught Sunday school class at the Cambridge jail in suburban Boston. She was shocked by the conditions that she saw. She immediately began visiting other jails in Massachusetts, New Jersey, and many other states. In the other states, she discovered the same thing in the jails. The mentally ill were confined to terrible conditions. Dix reported the horrible conditions which led to state legislatures providing funds for building state psychiatric hospitals for those who were mentally ill. Dix said the following regarding the confinement of those who were mentally ill. The mentally ill individuals do not belong in prisons and jails. Good treatment for the mentally ill persons is not possible in prisons and jails, and people running prisons and jails are not trained to provide such treatment. By 1847, it was widely accepted that mentally ill individuals should be cared for in hospitals, and as a result, many psychiatric hospitals were being built. By 1880, there were 75 psychiatric hospitals nationwide. From 1870 to 1970, it was widely accepted that the mentally ill again belonged in hospitals and not prisons and jails. From 1970 to the present, the United States returned to its earlier practice of confining those with mental health conditions to prisons and jails. And this is due to the emptying of state hospitals beginning in the 1960s, known as deinstitutionalization. As a result of deinstitutionalization, those mentally ill patients in state hospitals were discharged without follow-up psychiatric care. Therefore, many relapsed into mental crisis. Thus, many committed misdemeanors or felony offenses, usually due to their untreated mental illness, and were arrested. In the early 1970s, Dr. Mark Abramson, a psychiatrist in San Mateo County, California, reported the rapid increase of mentally ill individuals in the San Mateo County Jail. He called it the criminalization of mentally ill disordered behavior. After the 1970s, the United States returned to the earlier practice of confining those with mental health conditions to prisons and jails. As a result of hearings held in 1973 in the California State Senate, sheriffs from different counties reported that they were seeing an increase in mentally ill individuals in their jails. In the mid-1970s, several states across the country also reported an increase in the mentally ill in their jails. By the 1980s, it was widely known that deinstitutionalization was the cause of an increase of the mentally ill in the criminal justice system. As deinstitutionalization has continued during the past decade, the problem of confining the mentally ill in prisons and jails has become worse. The Treatment Advocacy Center reported in 2010 that there were more than 3 times the number of seriously mentally ill persons in jails and prisons than in hospitals. In 2013, it was reported that 28% of individuals receiving psychiatric treatment for a serious mental illness by the Connecticut Department of Mental Health System had contact with the criminal justice system within a 2-year period. Additionally, these individuals cost taxpayers twice as much as those who were being treated for the same conditions but were not involved in the criminal justice system. So problems with putting the mentally ill individuals in prisons and jails. There are several problems that are associated with putting the mentally ill into jails and prisons. Those inmates, and some of these follow, those inmates with mental illnesses remain longer than other prisoners without a mental illness. Many are unable to post bail, and then they also break rules, which lead them to have to stay longer, thus contributing to overcrowding. The average stay for Florida's Orange County Jail is 26 days for inmates and 51 days for mentally ill inmates. In New York's Rikers Island Jail, the average stay for inmates is 42 days. For those with a mental illness, it is 215 days. Many mentally ill inmates are at an increased risk for being abused. Many are abused as far as beatings, and then some are abused regarding rapes. Many mentally ill inmates become sicker while in prison or jail, especially if they are not being treated. Some inmates also physically harm themselves. Mentally ill inmates are able to refuse medicine in many prisons and jails. As a result, corrections officials can be sued legally in several states if they medicate a mentally ill inmate without their consent. Mentally ill inmates are also more likely to spend time in solitary confinement. Solitary confinement consists of confining an individual for 23 hours a day by themselves, including 1-hour showers and exercise. Meals are normally passed through a small opening into the cell. In 2003, jails in New York reported that approximately 25% of their mentally ill inmates were housed in solitary confinement. In 2013, Colorado state prisons reported that inmates with moderate to severe mental illness were housed in solitary confinement. In many cases, mentally ill individuals who refuse their medication often are confined to solitary confinement due to their behavior and for their own protection. There are suicides that occur among the mentally ill while in prisons and jails. Many mentally ill inmates are on suicide watch. As a result, many times they are watched every 15 minutes. This requires extra staff, thus increasing the cost of caring for a mentally ill inmate. Suicides are common sources of lawsuits against the prison or jail. Those inmates who exhibit a mental health condition while confined to prison or jail often cost more than those without a mental health condition. In Florida's Broward County Jail in 2007, the cost was $130 a day for mentally ill inmates compared to $80 a day for those who do not have a mental illness. In Texas prisons in 2003, mentally ill inmates cost between $30,000 to $50,000 a year compared to $22,000 for those who do not have a mental illness. In the state of Washington in 2009, the mentally ill inmate cost $101,653 each compared to $30,000 per year for those who were not mentally ill. Much of the cost also comes from medication costs. Mentally ill inmates tend to become part of the revolving door phenomenon, and I'll get into that in a second. Due to the lack of follow-up by the public mental health treatment system, many inmates often are rearrested and end up in the criminal justice system. The Los Angeles County Jail indicated that 88% of their inmates exhibited prior psychiatric hospitalization and 95% had previous contact with the criminal justice system. In summary, prisons and jail staff have the responsibility to care for the nation's most sickest inmates, regardless of whether they are trained to do so in many cases. Yet they are responsible when something goes wrong. There is no other policy in the United States that is equal to this type of policy. Treating the mentally ill in jail. What can be done if an inmate refuses medication, thereby becoming imminently dangerous to self or others? Well, many times administration of psychotropic medication given to an inmate who refuses to accept it voluntarily may often occur. So in this instance, a physician may indicate that medication is the most effective means of dealing with this situation. If the inmate refuses medication, the policy is for the inmate to be offered the opportunity to accept or refuse the treatment, and the government must satisfy that inmate's rights. In an emergency, psychotropic medications are usually administered by intramuscular injection. And so those psychotropic medications are just basically medications are used to treat psychosis. And so under emergency circumstances, when an inmate experiences an increase in severity of symptoms resulting in imminent danger to self or others, that is when they're given the psychotropic medication a lot of times. And a lot of times, again, it's through intramuscular injections. Also, in non-emergency situations, when treatment is needed to prevent an inmate's psychiatric condition from deteriorating to the point where he or she is unable to care for themselves or in danger of harming themselves, is when this medication is given to them. 13 states, and you see those states there, require a judicial hearing, yet this process may vary from county to county in each state. The purpose of the hearing is to determine whether the inmate meets the criteria for involuntary treatment. And involuntary treatment refers to medical treatment undertaken without the consent of the inmate. Also, the criteria itself that an inmate must meet vary from state to state. 5 states, and you see those states there, require inmate to be civilly committed to a state psychiatric hospital for treatment. Yet each county determines how their jails and prisons are administered. There are several counties in each state, and each state, again, has its own policies and procedures. As a result, it is impossible to represent the practices of all counties in each state. These are just some summaries. So my journey, I'd like to tell you a little bit about that and my experience with the criminal justice system. After completing my Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from Spelman College and subsequently having a career as a junior staff scientist at an environmental agency was when my mental illness first exhibited itself. I was living in Arlington, Virginia, and working in Rockville, Maryland. And so it first appeared through me having anxiety, then it progressed to me having thoughts of suicide. And this actually scared the living daylights out of me because I never had these thoughts before. I worked hard and never imagined I would ever experience a mental illness, but I did. I told my mother about what I was experiencing, and she told my great uncle, who was a surgeon. He told me that I needed to see a psychiatrist and take medication for my condition. He also told me that I needed to relocate to North Carolina, where my mother was living. I spoke to my mother again, and I told her how that I felt like a failure because I had to move back to North Carolina. And she immediately told me I would not feel like a failure. If I were up in that crazy city, I would leave too. So my mother hated cities, yet she lived in New York for a time, but grew up in North Carolina, and she was a Southern belle at heart. So again, I was living in Arlington, Virginia at the time and working in Rockville, Maryland, which is about 2 hours away. And during that time, my mother suggested that my father, who was living in the area at the time, stay with me just to keep a watch on me, if you will. So upon relocation to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, I saw a psychiatrist. He diagnosed me with having obsessive neurosis, now known as obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. And this is where an individual experiences repeated actions to feel normal. An example would be repeatedly turning on the lights off and on. So I lived about 45 minutes from Raleigh, where my mother lived. I worked at a Montessori school with children, and this was the best medicine for me. The anxiety and also suicidal thoughts ceased. Then I was hired as an associate scientist at an environmental company. After 2 years, I accepted another position as a chemist. While I was working in the position as a chemist, the anxiety came back. I saw another doctor who began treating me for depression. After a few years living in Chapel Hill, Raleigh, and also Fayetteville, North Carolina, I was pretty much stable until my mother got sick and was given 2 days to live. This sent me into a tailspin, if you will. I did not have a mental crisis per se, but it was very hard for me to deal with. After my mother died, I moved with my dad and stepmother to Washington, D.C. One morning, I awoke crying and I could not stop. My parents took me to the hospital and I was admitted into the psychiatric portion of the hospital. This was the first time I was ever admitted into a psychiatric portion of the hospital. Yet 24 years later, after completing my Master's of Science degree and also my PhD in interdepartmental nutrition from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in Lincoln, Nebraska, and also after working at the Johns Hopkins Center on Aging and Health as a senior research program coordinator, and also while working as executive director at an agency in DC, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Another doctor said that I had bipolar disorder all along. So in June 2011, I was working at the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts when one night I found myself in a mental crisis. And this was due to me listening to the bad advice of an individual who said she previously had depression and also not having access to my medication. The individual told me, "You never know. God could prevent you from getting your medicine, thereby getting you off of your medicine." The opportunity presented itself a few days later, little did I know. When I tried to refill my prescription, the pharmacist said that there was a glitch in the insurance portion of my membership. Mind you, I had re-enrolled 2 to 3 weeks earlier. As a result, the pharmacist would not refill my prescription. This was on a Saturday. I had to wait until that Monday to contact the insurance company as they were closed. I thought the medicine was too expensive for my parents to buy. Each one of them cost about $200 and I had 4 prescriptions. And so therefore I did not tell my parents about what I had just gone through. When the opportunity presented itself, I was not worried because I thought, God must be getting me off of my medication. And also I felt healthy. Well, on June 2nd, 2011, it did not matter that I had an educational background, a history of a professional career, nor did it matter about the awards that I previously received. All that mattered on June 2nd, 2011 was that I was in a mental crisis and I was in a compromised position. The ambulance was called, but the police arrived instead. After the police officers arrived, I recall sitting on the bench outside of the hotel lobby where I was living, and I saw a policewoman in the distance, motioning with her hands and smiling and saying, "Come on." Once when I went with her, I sealed my fate into the Fairfax County criminal justice system in Virginia. I was handcuffed and thrown into the police car. Instead of taking me to the hospital, I was arrested and jailed. I was jailed for 6 days without my medication. Once in jail, I went downhill fast. While in jail, I was put on suicide watch, which was basically solitary confinement. I experienced reoccurring hallucinations. Upon entry into the hospital, which was approximately 1.5 to 2 hours away from where I was living, I could not walk, talk, or feed myself. It took 6 weeks for me to recover. So my way to recovery, I had to depend totally on my faith for strength. My dad was my emotional supporter. He called me almost every day while I was in recovery at the hospital. My mom was my advocate. She spoke to those who could help me, from my doctors to the social worker and even to my lawyer. The social worker would not tell my mom whether or not I was in that particular hospital. My mom used to work as a news anchor in Atlanta, Georgia, and she threatened to go to the news media about me being lost in the system. Needless to say, the social worker called her the next day and told her that I was in that hospital. Nothing can replace the feel of a parent's love. I am so thankful for my parents because through all of this, their love never wavered. They were and have been very supportive of me, and I am so thankful for them. There was a point where I almost gave up on my faith, yet at one point, my faith immediately kicked in, and immediately I knew that all would be all right. Someone told me also during this time not to lose hope, so I fought to keep my hope. I delved into the things that I like to do, and for me, that was writing and art. I listened to my favorite type of music. I attended group facilitated meetings at an outpatient facility that addressed behavioral health. Also, I saw and still see my doctor for prescribed medication. I also saw and still see my psychotherapist. And then also I visit with relatives and friends. I am doing well now. I do things that I enjoy, such as writing, art, museums, going to the movies, and getting together with my family and friends. So why am I doing well? Well, my faith has helped me tremendously in my recovery. I work in a position that is not too stressful. I enjoy work. So previously, though, I worked in management positions, which was too stressful for me. And so while working in those management positions, all I did was went to work, church, and home. I now have more of a social life, which is really helping me. I have learned to turn my obstacle into an opportunity by working to develop a public speaking career based on my lived experience with bipolar disorder. So what about the state of Virginia? What is going on at this point since I was arrested in 2011? Just to give you a background, Eastern State Hospital is the largest remaining state psychiatric hospital in Virginia. In Jarrett, Virginia, the Greensville Correctional Center is the largest state prison, which confines about 3,006 inmates. A state inspector general's report, which was reported in January 2014, indicated that Virginia's jails hold about 3 times more individuals with serious mental illnesses, which equals out to about 3,554 inmates, than do the state the state hospitals, which is about 1,200 patients. Virginia Department of Corrections operating procedures require that a court order be obtained for the non-emergency involuntary administration of medication. The court must find, on the basis of clear and convincing evidence, that the prisoner is incapable, either mentally or physically, of giving informed consent to such treatment, and that the proposed treatment is in the best interest of the prisoner or inmate. County jails in Virginia usually manage inmates who refuse medication or are in need of treatment within the jail, either by isolating that inmate and observing them, or by seeking involuntary commitment to a state hospital. At the time of my arrest, the programs that I will cite were either not in existence or in the beginning stages of development. So to date, some progress has been made in the state of Virginia regarding the criminalization of the mentally ill. So there has been a development of a mental health docket, and this is where defendants are held accountable for their actions while gaining the tools they need to better manage their mental health needs and also live healthier and happier lives without criminal justice involvement. The goals of most mental health dockets are to reduce mental health symptoms and the use of crisis services by enhancing access to treatment, to address other defendant needs through clinical assessment and effective case management, and also to reduce recidivism. These dockets are designed to address the root cause of the defendant's criminal justice involvement, which often is the result of the symptoms of their mental illnesses. Then there is a program called Divert First, or Diversion First. This serves people with mental illnesses co-occurring substance use disorders, and that means those who exhibit a mental illness and a substance use. It also addresses those with developmental disabilities, which is those people who have difficulties with language, mobility, learning, and also independent living. The goals of Divert First is to divert people to treatment instead of incarceration. Additionally, to divert people from the cycle of crime as well. Mental illness and substance use disorders gone untreated in the jail often result in recidivism, and that is going back to jail again and repeatedly again. Then there is a program that has been developed, and that is Crisis Intervention Team Training for Law Enforcement. They often call it CIT training. This is where the law enforcement officers participate in a 40-hour instruction dealing with mental illness, simulation, and also practical exercises. Teaches the officers how to deal with those in a mental crisis, those experience a co-occurring substance use disorder, and also it addresses youth and adults with developmental disabilities. Also, there has been the community service boards, and this offers services for individuals with mental illnesses, substance use disorders, and those with developmental disabilities. It offers emergency services for people experiencing a psychiatric emergency. Also, it helps people in crisis to stabilize. That they provide calming rooms, and then they also can provide medication if need be. It assesses individuals to determine best course of action, and also this is also a place of transfer of police custody. So if an individual is in a mental crisis and if they committed a crime, the officer would take them to this place in order to transfer custody so that they would not be arrested. Currently, every person who enters into a Virginia jail is now receiving a mental health screening. This comes from Tracy Eppard, and that was through a communication with Senator Deed's office. She also said many of the recommendations this year were budget related. In terms of criminal justice, the General Assembly increased funding for jail discharge planning by $1.6 million each year. Again, that's coming from a personal communication with Ms. Eppard. 6 CIT assessment sites and training programs were added in unserved areas, and you see the amount of money that was earmarked for that. So suggestions to improve the system. I can only speak in the things that I saw while I was arrested and experienced in terms of suggestions to improve the system. In my case, in many cases too, there is a breakdown in the system. This is referred to as the 85-15% rule of management, described by William Edward Deming. This rule states that if you trace service breakdowns back to the root cause, about 85% of the time, the fault lies within the system, process structures, and or practices of the organization itself. Only about 50% of the service breakdown can be traced back to someone who didn't care or was not conscientious enough. In my case, as far as the pharmacy is concerned, the glitch was in my insurance, was the breakdown in the system. The pharmacist was just following the policies and regulations. The regulations need to be changed, which is part of the system. Mental health consumers should be able to receive their medication no matter what. After all, this is a life or death situation. At issue also was the police officers' training. The officers were just following regulations deemed by the criminal justice system. At that time, they needed the crisis intervention team training. This training, again, trains police officers in addition to first responders how to recognize individuals in a mental crisis and how to respond. The police officer did not place me in the police car. He threw me in the police car. Therefore, this police officer needed sensitivity training. 911 was called, but the ambulance didn't arrive. The police arrived instead. The breakdown could have been at the dispatcher's level. How he or she described my condition could have been the key. She could have also called the police instead of the ambulance. And just remember, countless others go through what I went through, and even oftentimes worse. After recovery, I had to spend one more night in jail. This should not be. After recovery, one should not have to spend another night in jail as a result of regulations. But again, this is a breakdown in the system. I did not receive my medication on time while in jail the second time. Medicine in jails or prisons should be given on time as directed by the medical facility. Whenever I asked for my medication at the time, each time the officer said, "The nurse is not on the floor." This suggests that there is a staffing shortage in this area of the justice system. Many states continue to cut mental health service funding. The burden then falls on the jails and correctional systems that are ill-equipped to handle the job of properly caring for mentally ill individuals. Also, sensitivity training. After returning to jail the second time per policy after my recovery, a policeman who was handling my medicine and another inmate's meds, which was in a clear bag, said, "This is a drugstore." Again, lack of sensitivity. This should not be. This statement alone could have sent the both of us into a state of depression. He also needed CIT training and sensitivity training. There is a need for funding in this area of mental health system. There is a need for more mental health care providers within the community. Many providers are overloaded with cases of clients, and in the end, the patient suffers. Medicine should be affordable. In one case I read while doing my research, an individual with a mental illness skimped on his food in order to have enough money to buy his medication. Eating 3 meals a day and healthy meals is essential to staying mentally stable. It is important that community services boards are properly funded in order to treat those with mental health conditions. Research indicates that where there is no mental health services, individuals will cycle in and out of jails or prisons. In conclusion, individuals with severe mental health conditions need to be in hospitals, not prisons or jails. More funding needs to be provided to the mental health system in order to improve its services to those who have a mental health condition. Although work is being done regarding decreasing the numbers of inmates with mental health conditions in prisons and jails, more needs to be done because the problem still exists. Individuals in a mental crisis who commit minor offenses are still being arrested every day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol, for such an informative webinar, and it's very important, and we do have a couple questions.
Okay.
So let me see. So the first question is about the California Assembly and Senate, I believe 2 days ago, advanced a system or a bill to replace the bail system. People that are judged as criminals with mental illness and are charged for petty crime who may be released on their own recognizance. If they're deemed low risk, they might be quickly released. Do you think it'd be better for the mentally ill to be placed in one of the hospital jails, or for this situation of the bill would advance?
I don't think they should be placed in hospital jails because, hospital jails are still jails. And, that's where I can take it from because I was in jail, and I actually had fear after I got out of jail. I've never been in jail before, and I was on the mental health unit. May have not been in the hospital, it was mental health unit, but I was in jail, and that does not solve the situation. I hope I answered your question.
Do you think that being jailed for mental illness creates an additional stigma for those battling with their mental illness?
Yes, I sure do. Because I think people are less judgmental they're still judgmental, but people are less judgmental. I think if you go into the hospital, have a mental illness, yes, there's still stigma, but I think when they see a person who has been in jail, they look at you twice. Why were you in jail? What crime did you commit? And I think it's more judgmental if you've been in jail with a mental illness.
This is a question about caregivers. This caregiver would like to know that if you think that calling the police on somebody in an episode should be the last resort, or if this is something you should do early on as a preventative measure.
Well, I think, I think it should be a last resort. I think if the person is suicidal or if the person is harming people within their home or elsewhere, yes, I think they should be called CIT. They should call the CIT officers as a result, because otherwise, what are you going to do? You may be in fear for your life, and I think that there should be some type of avenue that will help people in crisis, even though, as far as caring for as a caregiver, I think it should be the last resort. A lot of times the CIT trained officers are trained to handle such situations, and we everyday people are not.
This next question is switching gears a little bit, and the person asks, what advice would you give to a young person recently diagnosed with bipolar disorder?
I think you need to find the right doctor, right therapist, and everyone may not need medication, but I would inquire about seeing if that person needs medication.
Okay. The next question is, are mental health dockets similar to mental health courts?
Yes, they are. Well, I can't say that. Mental health dockets are not as, I hate to say not as effective, but I think mental health courts are mainly better, but they are a difference. To tell you the truth, I don't know what the difference is, but they are different.
What agency are these individuals referred to?
What individuals?
Those that would be in the mental health docket.
What? Can you repeat that?
Oh, 1 second. Technical difficulties.
Okay.
So the question was, first, are mental health dockets similar to mental health court? And then the next question was, what agency are these individuals referred to? What agency provides the court diversion plans and support?
Well, it's the judicial system itself. Now, if there is someone who is in jail and want to get out, a lot of times they are followed up by the Community Services Board, if I'm not mistaken. And the reason why I say that is because there's a girl who is a member of my church, and she has a mental illness, and she was arrested on a felony while she was in a mental crisis. And so I called to see how, we could help her through my church. And actually she would be referred to, if she's getting out of jail on probation, if she's getting out, she would be referred to the Community Services Board.
Okay, the next question. Do you have any advice for a person with felony convictions as a result of mental illness-related crimes? Are there ways to get the convictions reduced or eliminated for the purpose of job searches?
I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. My arrest was on a misdemeanor, so I'm not familiar much with the felony aspect, but I'm thinking that you may want to check with your probation officer to see what avenues you can get through him.
Okay, the next question. They say, a big part of the problem in California is that once in the criminal justice system, a mentally ill individual is judged to be mentally competent to defend himself by a judge who uses a very low bar with no understanding of psychosis. This is a huge failure in the crimping justice courts. What do you think can be done This is a terribly weak link in the system. The result is a huge extension of jail time for ill persons.
I think working with local mental health, state agencies would be a help. But then I also think working with hospitals, people who are within the hospital who see this situation every day, and state hospitals would also be an avenue I think that would help. Forensic hospitals, forensic state hospitals.
Do you have any suggestions on how we can appeal to our state or governments, local law enforcement, to make changes in the judicial system surrounding the mentally ill?
Yeah, I think working as a group, and a lot of times I really believe working through NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, would really help. It's better to deal with a group as opposed to just one person. A group has more of influence than just one person. I think if you work with NAMI, I think that would be an avenue. And the only reason why I say that is because they do have information on their website that states their position, and I think working with NAMI would be an avenue, National Alliance on Mental Illness.
Okay. It looks like that was the last question for now.
Okay.
So we're going to wrap up, everybody. If you do have any additional questions that you think of later, you are more than welcome to email me at agood@ibpf.org. You can also find my email on the website if you forget that. I just want to thank Dr. Ray again. That was a really great webinar, and I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and I hope that you enjoyed our new platform. I think it makes things a little bit easier. So we look forward to seeing you at our next one.
Okay. Thank you, Aubrey.
Bye, everybody.